Hey, folks, we're back here on the Peaceful Way with another dialogue episode. I am here with Sal Mayweather. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, Sal, also known as Sal the Agorist on Twitter. Um, so Sal is an agorist. Okay, and my first question is, Sal, why don't you think that if we just vote harder, we'll get things to change?
Well, number one, it's first of all, whether or not it works is irrelevant because it's immoral, right?
Mm,
No one has the right to impose a master on their neighbors. It doesn't matter how benevolent that person may be or how benevolent one may think that person is. It's irrelevant. Now, if we put the moral issues to the side, it doesn't work, right? It's a failed experiment. Gary Johnson ran in 2016 against Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, a reality television star and a woman who should have been in prison, and he got 3% of the vote. So it's a rigged game, and frankly, it's frustrating that people don't see how rigged it is, right?
yeah.
Like I said, a reality television star and a woman who should have been in prison, the best he could do is 3%. So, and that's just one of many examples.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, I mean that was a partly facetious question, but I totally get your points there. It is. There's only, in my mind, there's only so much the political process can do. And now, me myself, I don't know if I'm fully on the agorist bandwagon, but I am, say, agorist curious. Okay, I've sort of, I only have like a surface level understanding of the philosophy. I think I kind of get the gist of it. But why don't you just explain to me and to everyone listening what is agorism, and yeah, just what is agorism?
Well, I mean, usually people will define it as counter economics, but an easier way to understand what agorism is or what the agora is just to think about it like the absence of politics. Imagine a world where there were no politicians, no political institutions, only economics, only free market economics at play. That's the agora, and agorism is the process of getting there, which involves counter economics, the use of the black and gray markets, the voluntary markets, the peaceful markets to subvert or undermine the violent pink and red markets that the state operates in.
Okay. So what would be an example of a uh black or gray market?
So a black market is anything that's consistent with the non-aggression principle, which means that there's no property crimes involved, and it's also prohibited by the state. So that's like things would be like selling weed would be a black market crime, right?
Yeah.
A gray market crime. A gray market refers to market activity that's consistent with the non-aggression principle, but the state regulates it. It's not outright banned, but it is regulated. So um, things like smuggling cigarettes would be a gray market activity
Okay.
because cigarettes aren't banned, but they are heavily regulated. If so, all smuggling essentially would be a gray market activity. Growing food and selling it at the black market under the
Right.
table, that's a gray market activity.
Yeah. Yeah, if we don't have our sort of state overlords giving us permission to
Right? Yeah,
to
and
trade
they do,
food, yeah.
and they do. Yeah, I mean, I that's one of the best examples I give people is to like who want to get involved. Is I say start a garden,
Right.
right? Because you're it's even this is just a few dollars. You're denying the state a little bit of revenue that they would have otherwise used to oppress people.
Right, right. Okay. That's interesting. Now me, I'm I don't know that I'm fully convinced that we should completely exit out of the political process yet. I can be convinced. I'm open to it. But it does seem to me there's definitely like huge diminishing returns in engaging in the political process. There's only so much that can actually be done, and it seems there's more effective ways to reduce violence and create a more peaceful world that involves just sort of um, becoming an almost anti-political actor in a market or in a society. in the sense that you do things that are permissionless, you know. And I'm thinking of something like what you just said is a great example. Growing your own food is permissionless, but even things like from what I understand, agorist, is that how you pronounce it? Agorism?
Potato, potato.
Okay, yeah. The agorists are really into things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Is that something you would also advocate for?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have my Bitcoin Cash shirt on
Oh,
right
okay,
now.
there you go.
Yeah, so the when I look at the government, which is the enemy, they're the ones who are committing all this violence, then I think to myself, well, how have they structured their power over us? And it always goes back to the money, right? It's true what they say. It's such a cliche, but if you just follow the money, you get
Right.
back to the source of the problem, right? And all roads lead back to the central bank. It's
Yeah.
the ability to counterfeit money that enables them to carry on these endless wars and uh, enable the police state and the military industrial complex and the welfare state. That all comes about through the inflationary powers. So as agorists, we want to target the central bank. That's our enemy. And the way to do this, see, the bank is it's a cartel. It's a cartel of private banks, and that is what the Federal Reserve is. I know it sounds conspiratorial, but if your listeners look it up, they'll see that I'm not being hyperbolic at all. It actually is a cartel of banks. And the
Right.
way to beat a cartel is to offer a superior product at a lower price. So cryptocurrencies are non-inflationary, and they don't require the use of third-party intermediaries. So if you and I were going to do an exchange, or any two people who are not face to face want to do an exchange, you need a third party. Visa, a bank, some third party has to verify that one of us has sent those funds and also that the other has received them. So now with Bitcoin, we don't need that. We have a network of individuals, of miners, verifying these transactions that cuts out the government and the banks out of this process, which means that people can now transact without the fear of third-party censorship. And
Right.
that is, you look at a good example of this would be like the Silk Road with Ross Ulbricht.
Yeah.
He was able to enable this massive amount of peaceful trade, right? It was all consistent with the non-aggression principle. And they were so threatened. The state was so threatened. All he did was make a website
Yeah.
where people would list items and buy them and stuff like that. And there were all sorts of black and gray market stuff on this website, but that wasn't what scared them, right? It wasn't the drugs or anything like that. They made up lies about him at court, and it was the idea that someone didn't need them, that we could transact economically, we could be free of them financially, because that is the death knell for them, and that's why I'm so bullish on cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Um, eh, and what do you think? What would you say to the charge against cryptocurrency and against websites like the Silk Road that people just use it to buy drugs and weapons and human trafficking, and there's all sorts of interesting accusations I hear about it, none of which I've ever heard to be verified, but I'm just saying this is something I often hear about the use of cryptocurrency, and it's unregulated, so there's all these dangerous activities we might be able to engage in.
Well, what's ironic about all that is that, if you go back to the Silk Road, uh, people were selling drugs, but what would happen is um, you would have a seller who, let's say we're selling heroin, right? Well, now if some Joe Schmo wants to come and buy heroin from us, he can click on our listing and he could see how many reviews we have. And we have 5 stars. No
Okay.
one's ever overdosed on our heroin.
Hmm.
So Ross actually made the process much more safer. Uh,
Right.
the whole he was see what makes drugs is so dangerous is that it's in the black market. So the market can't develop the surrounding infrastructure to like care for that individual. Like in Vancouver, they've legalized to some extent drugs, and now there's clinics where doctors can take care of you and nurses, and they'll test your needle and they'll test your heroin to make sure it's not poison. So the market will provide for these things if we allow it, but the state prevents us from doing that. So look, there's always going to be people transacting, and that's the other thing too, is they say, Well, people buy drugs and guns with Bitcoin for that exact reason, right? Well, no currency has ever seen more illegal transactions than the US dollar.
Right.
So what's a dirtier money, you know?
Well, yeah, and my question to that is always like, how many bombs have been dropped
Yeah,
using the U.S. dollar, right, to
right.
to fund
And how many
whatever
have been
it is.
dropped using Bitcoin?
Yeah, exactly.
Compare the numbers, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. Yeah, it doesn't even seem like a fair comparison.
Right.
But yeah, so do you see like uh, do you see any like modern day examples of sort of this counter economics concept starving the state of its power in any significant way, or even in a small microcosm?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. First of all, look at what 3D printers have done, right? We've ended the gun control debate essentially.
Right,
Uh, but that's only one example. Another would be we're starting to see something I'm really excited about is this whole coming wave of tokenized securities and assets. I think a lot of libertarians are sleeping on this. A lot of people in general, the whole world, frankly, is sleeping on this. You can create a digital representation of ownership, which exists on a blockchain ledger, much like a Bitcoin. But rather than Bitcoin, you could be trading shares, ownership shares of a company. So that is going to really decrease the role that FINRA and the SEC play in our lives, right? Because now FINRA is essentially a cartel of brokers. And if you want to buy a security, you have to go through one of their brokers. So because it's a cartel, what they're doing is they're restricting the supply of brokerage, which is driving up the cost, and it's making it more difficult for firms to access capital.
right.
Well, once we make it possible for firms, it is possible today to tokenize their entire business and then list those businesses on decentralized exchanges. Well, all of a sudden, the SEC and FINRA can't do a damn thing about it. They're in the same
Right,
position that the ATF is in with 3D printing, or the Federal Reserve is in with Bitcoin, right? We've essentially castrated the beast.
right,
So, the other thing too is I think that there's an enormous financial opportunity, right? So we use Austrian economics to learn about Bitcoin, and we made a bunch of money. Some people made more than others. I didn't make as much as I would like to, but some people got filthy rich off the wave of Bitcoin.
yeah.
Well, we're going to see the same thing happen with tokenization. Um, if people who are early on this are going to really make a significant penny, I think, because
So that would essentially, sorry to interrupt you, but that would essentially be just like, instead of me buying like a federally regulated share between the trading hours on the, say, Nasdaq, or here I'm in Canada, so the TSX is where we buy our shares. It would just be anyone can sort of buy a token as a share of that company, so to speak.
exactly.
Is that the correct understanding?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's precisely it. But it doesn't have to be just like a securitized firm. It could be an asset, right? It could
Yeah.
be your car. It could be you and I and three friends could all chip in, buy a car together, tokenize the car, and then trade those tokens around. And let's say we rent out the car, and then we can have a dividend for all token holders to receive payments every month, every 2 months, whatever it is. So it's really going to revolutionize the way property rights are enforced, and I think it's going to be a disaster for the state, frankly. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine what a huge wave of capital that's going to unleash on firms, and that's just
Right.
going to it's going to be like a snowball effect. You know what I mean?
Well, I could only imagine the sort of gatekeepers and uh, heavy-handed regulations and bureaucracies that we're all are making incredibly inefficient markets, and it makes us all poorer, really. Though
Exactly.
all those things, it makes the use of our time and our resources far more inefficient, and then that takes more time, and then we all become poorer. So that totally makes sense to me, and that's a very compelling
And,
idea.
the other thing too is that let's say you and I have competing businesses. Well, if you tokenize your business, you're tapping into this previously inaccessible pool of liquidity. So
Right.
now I have an incentivization. I'm incentivized now where, oh geez, all my competitors are taking advantage of this increased liquidity, man, I really should do the same if I want to keep my business afloat. So it's going to sort of have, it's almost like a dog chasing its tail. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Are you kind of what's your like take on like here's my premise. It is Andy, this is a conversation that I have like with a lot of peace advocates and nonviolent people, and not just kind of in the libertarian sphere, but outside of it. I, a lot of them do not want to sort of accept the general premise. Maybe they do, but they don't really. There's sort of a lot of cognitive dissonance. But the premise that uh, any state that is currently in existence is based on force and the threat of violence to whoever doesn't comply with said state. And whether you think that's like a necessary evil or not is a separate question, but a lot of people don't really want to be honest about that question. Um, and if we can at least agree on the premise that the state is based on a systemic violence, let's call it, and the threat of locking people in cages for nonviolent crimes and nonviolent actions. How do you like in agorism? Is it like a revolutionary thing? Like, are do agorists think that the best way forward is to take up arms against the state, or is it more just undermining and subverting the state?
Yeah, we completely reject the idea of initiatory violence at all, anywhere it pops its head up. Agorism is the opposite of initiatory violence. The whole
Right.
philosophy is based on, like I said, the agora is the when we earlier we were discussing what it is. It's the absence of politics, so it's the absence of violence.
Yeah.
Going back to like what you were saying about how the state is inseparable from violence. That's how Murray Rothbard, a great economist, defined the state as the entity which exercises a monopoly on violence over a given territory. So
Right.
it's logically it's inclusive in the definition is the initiation of violence, and that's the problem with the state, right?
Yeah.
If it was if any of their ideas were so good, then wouldn't be a state. They
Right.
wouldn't have to, right? It would be these ideas would be voluntarily adopted by individuals rather than having a gun stuck in our face and forcing us to obey.
Right. Right. Yeah, it is it seems to me that that's like the
But
what you
like,
go ahead.
yeah, no, no, you know, a great example of this, right? So, like, look at what Gandhi did, right,
Yeah.
with Satyagraha, as he used to call it, and the salt march to the sea, right? The British were taxing the salt, and that was the key to their rule over the Indian people. So Gandhi just used peaceful economics, right? He just showed everybody, look, we can get salt right out of the ocean. We don't need to pay their tax. And the
Right.
British
Right.
Empire withered away. He was able to take down one of the most violent entities in human history without ever raising a fist.
Right. Right.
And that's agorism. That's counter economics.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a lot more malleable with sort of my view on things. Is I want to reduce violence, not increase it. And even if we might be justified in taking up arms against the state, is it the best way to go about, because just from my own reading of history, it seems that violent revolutions always just replace despots with more despots, and it's hard to get away from that, if that makes
And
sense.
absolutely. And just a quick trip through history. You know, the French went through this with Robespierre. The English had Cromwell. We had Washington. Whoever chops the tyrant's head off is the one who becomes the next tyrant.
Yeah.
But moreover, I can't think of one violent revolution that didn't cause an innocent individual to lose their life.
Right. Yeah.
There's never so we hear like a lot of this talk about on the internet about the boogaloo, right?
Yeah.
They're going to frankly, it's just these kids larping, right?
Yeah.
But they're never going to do anything. Thank God.
Yeah.
I hope they don't, because
Yeah.
they're going to walk into the state capitol and shoot the place up. Do you think that they're only going to get the most evil politicians? No, there's going to be clerks and interns and people just walking through
Right.
who
Right.
are going to
Yeah.
be their victims.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that makes them just as disgusting as politicians,
Yeah. Totally.
you know?
What's your take on like I think it was what's I'm trying to think of the state. Is it the Michigan State House or something where there's people uh gathering on the legislature, and they're coming armed and obviously very menacing and intimidating. I'm sort of like caught between like, while they're responding to a violent state that is aggressing against them, and yet at the same time it seems that method of like just raising the tensions by doing those sort of theatrics, is it the best way to go about? What's your opinion on?
I I tend to think you're right on both accounts. So, on the one hand, uh, the Michigan Governor Whitmer, who I've been calling Whitler because she acts more like Hitler than any other governor, she is no doubt initiating violence upon peaceful people. There's no way
Right.
around that. Um, so I think as long as people don't use violence, I don't care if you protest with your rifle on your back. That's no problem as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But if we look at what's a more effective tactic, right? You can go march around the Capitol building with your rifles all day long,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, Michigan's still on lockdown, right? You still are going to go to jail if you cut hair. So they didn't accomplish anything.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
if they had used counter economics, instead of protesting, and all of the barbers said, "Oh, you know what? Screw it. You're gonna cut
Yeah.
hair anyway."
Yeah. Yeah.
They can't arrest every barber in the state of Michigan, so that would have been
Right.
a much more effective tactic. That's also uh, a little bit more consistent, I guess, with the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, it is it is one of those things where I'm kind of like unsure. I'm not sure it's the best use of time, but it, I do get it, but it's
Protesting in general, to me, is kind of silly. It's
okay. Elaborate on that.
well, I mean, we saw in Virginia. Excuse me, we saw in Virginia when Ralph Northam was doing, I forget what it was, background checks, or so he was doing something with guns.
Yeah.
The people went nuts, right? There was like
Right,
10,000
right.
people showed up at the state house, and they marched around like all day long with 50 cals and everything. But at the end of the day, the next day they went home, and the Virginia state legislature passed all those bills anyway.
Oh man, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, it's
It
like,
made no difference
it
really.
makes no difference. And you
Yeah.
guys, look, yeah, you're on the news for the day, and
Yeah.
it makes you look cool on TV and stuff. But you look, we're not about looking cool. This is about actually achieving results.
Right,
And
right.
the only way that we've ever been able to do this is with counter economics. So, you
Yeah.
know, and we calculated it. I forget what it was, but the amount of time they were protesting, I could have printed out like 3 FGC 9s. Like they were there for like, you know what I mean? So it's like we can ask Governor Northam, who's a tyrant, for permission to have rights, or
Yeah.
we can just exercise them like the free men that we already are.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think that's probably see, so I'm in Canada, so it's and people are tend to be a lot more compliant than they are in the state. It's like a cultural thing, you know. We never had like a revolutionary war against the British. We're technically still part of the British
Right.
Empire. So
Yeah.
it's there's sort of this there's this very compliant attitude, and it's hard to get like, yeah, I get the idea. If a bunch of us just didn't comply, there'd be nothing the state could do. Like they couldn't. It would be too big for them to enforce. They might give lip service to such and such a rule, but at the end of the day, there's nothing they can do. But in Canada, there are some people who are exercising civil disobedience, but it's such a small amount, and it's easy for the state to turn them into scapegoats and basically say, especially with you know, at time of recording this, we're still sort of under some soft lockdown measures in Canada for the COVID-19 pandemic, and uh, there's there's um, there's there is a few people who are like resisting and putting up some resistance, but the state just ends up making examples out of them, and the culture doesn't really support them at all. So what is it, do you think there's any methods or tactics we can take to engage in civil disobedience that doesn't put ourselves in like significant harm's way?
Well, the thing about counter economics is that there's always a some degree of risk involved because
Yeah.
we're dealing with black and gray markets. But you know, look at like marijuana in the states, right? It went from it went from being illegal to everybody was doing it so much and so often and so out in the open that it was unenforceable.
Right.
It was just they couldn't do it. So they couldn't prohibit it anymore. So the only out that they had was to try to make it look like they were being benevolent and saying, "Okay, we've changed our minds.
Mm.
You guys can smoke pot now, right?"
Yeah, yeah.
But that wasn't what it was about, right? They didn't have a choice. It was unenforceable. There was a video. I don't know if it was in California or New Jersey of a couple people. Some girl had run to the beach, and two cops, went running after her, and all the public watching was so upset by it, that they all ran to the beach too. And now there's like 500 people on the beach, and the cops just have to let her go because there's nothing they could do about it.
Right. Okay.
So it's a matter of over.
So so that would be like an example of agorism. It's not, it doesn't, you don't even necessarily have to be thinking that's what you're doing. Like you're just engaging in it, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Y- you know, there's also different levels of agorism. I would say, like, any way you can deny the state a dollar is
Yeah.
agorism, and jumping on the beach to help that girl is agorism. And then there's more like nuanced tactics that we use.
Okay.
So like, uh, I don't know how deep we want to go, but like, there's a horizontal and a vertical strategy to agorism where
Okay. Explain that. I want to hear it.
yeah, yeah. So essentially, one, you have the local production. It's a two-headed snake here. You have the local production facility, and then you have the other end of it would be just peaceful voluntary exchange, right? So Per Byland, an economist at Oklahoma State, has a great article where he expounded on this theory. He's a great agorist, and he said, the true strength of counter economics comes from a union of the two strategies. So, for example, we'll take like the 3D printer. That's your local production facility, and then the true power, the true way you nullify the gun laws, the ATF, and all the different federal gun laws, is through voluntary exchange of those guns, right? And the same thing with your blockchain miner is your local production facility, or you're creating a currency, and then you distribute that Bitcoin. You trade it around to your friends and merchants and clients and stuff like that. That would be just the trading aspect, the voluntary trading aspect of it. And when we unite those two strategies is when we have the greatest effect.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Interesting. I also wanted to ask you about sort of what your view is on I don't know how to word it, but like technology, because I'm a very like, I'm very optimistic about technology personally, and like you're mentioning things like 3D printing and Bitcoin and these sort of technologies. I even, you even go further, things like uh, mass farming and agriculture have been able to provide a countless amount of food for a countless amount of people, right? And I'm generally hopeful about technology, even though it can definitely be used in a bad way. It is I do think at the end of the day, technology does more to liberate us than it does to harm us. But there is a lot I see on both the left and the right sides of the political spectrum of this like skepticism of technology, that technology is something to be feared, and it certainly gets used in bad ways. And there's a lot of like hate on social media companies, and there's a lot of fear about things like 5G, stuff like that. And it's people get really caught up in the weeds, not really, to me, not really looking at the bigger picture, that technology is a net good for us, even, and it helps to actually create a more peaceful society when we learn how to leverage the technology in such a way. What's your view on, you know, technological advancement in that sense?
I agree with you 100%. I'm very optimistic. I think that technology is really just like it's part of this whole trend towards decentralization that we see, the empowerment of the individual, right?
Yeah,
That's what a 3D printer is. Just we have a whole manufacturing plant in your basement, right?
yeah,
The blockchain miner, you have a whole bank in your house. So it's all about empowering the individual and decentralizing towards that point. Now, there is a lot of hate on tech companies, and I understand a lot of that, but I think that it's a step in the right direction.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
you
but
know, so I'd rather Facebook spy on us than the NSA, because I have a choice whether or not I can use Facebook. I don't have a choice if the
yeah,
NSA is going to spy on me. And
totally.
I think it's only one step too. I think once we start to tokenize um, a lot of the online content, then, and we already see it happening, right, with sites like Minds, where if you post on Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg he owns your content.
Yeah,
But if you post on Minds, you own your content. You get paid Minds tokens based on how many views your post gets.
yeah,
So I think that's a trend we're going to see more and more of. So we're moving from the state was spying on us and they controlled our data to a little bit more of a decentralized process where rather than one monolithic state controlling our data, we have, a dozen or 2 dozen tech companies controlling our data. But
right,
that's done
right.
in a voluntary way. And the next step is going to be where we control our data.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Do you think that it's like it's more just I I do agree to an extent that, like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, Google, they are doing probably unethical things that are sort of insidious in some ways, and they're partnering with the state in a lot of instances as well. However, do you think that it's maybe just a matter of time before we're able to innovate our way out of those paradigms?
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. That's one of the hopes of tokenization. And
Yeah, yeah.
I just had two articles on the New Libertarian about
Okay.
this. One was called Digital Feudalism, and the other was called AI in the Agora.
Okay.
And in a certain sense, we really are like digital serfs, and working on these tech CEOs. Every post on Twitter makes money for Jack. Every post on Facebook makes money for Zuckerberg. Uh, we're doing the work, but we're not getting paid. So we
Yeah.
really are like feudal serfs in that sense. But I think that's going to change with technology. Um, and also, I think like you know, if we compare like the way that sort of like what China does with their citizens' data, right? Everything goes through WeChat. There's one super app
Yeah, yeah.
where data is collected, and then that data is going to be used to for artificial intelligence purposes. And now it's being used. Now they have access to this huge pool of data, because that's really what all AI requires, right? Is just more. The more data you feed into AI, the more accurate it becomes. So China doesn't give their citizens a choice; they just collect everyone's data.
Right.
So now, when they have the Hong Kong protests, they're able to use that information to identify who the troublemakers are, right? Or
Yeah.
another example would be like facial recognition technology. We see how they've been using that,
Mhm.
but it's important to remember that if the state can use that tech, well, so can we,
Right.
right? So now there's companies popping up who uh, design makeup and hairstyles that are
Okay.
they're designed to, in different mass companies as well, they're designed to throw off these facial recognition sensors. So I'm extremely optimistic with technology. Also we hear like the economic argument, like we're all going to lose our jobs, but that's nonsense,
Yeah.
because Rothbard wrote Rothbard wrote a lot about this, how like there's really nothing to be concerned about, because whenever we lose those old legacy jobs, they get replaced with newer, higher paying jobs. in higher tech sectors of the economy.
Right. Yeah, and whenever someone brings up that sort of concept, it's I always just remind them, like, everyone thought that the horse and buggy going away was going to, you know, eliminate so many jobs,
Exactly.
but really just new jobs were created through that, you know.
Right. I mean, we can think about how many more jobs we can get back if we, go back to the days before the printing press. And we hired the calligraphers back,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean, we can get all those calligraphers can get their jobs back, but we can't use computers. You
yeah.
know.
Well, I think there's a quote from Milton Friedman where he says, like, if jobs is all you're concerned about, then just hire people to dig holes and fill them back up again, right? So
And it's like right out of Keynes's playbook.
yeah, 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 pretty much, yeah, yeah. That's some pretty interesting concepts there. I wanted to go back a little bit to you mentioned Ross Ulbricht. And I'm just kind of curious. I actually haven't done the reading or the research on it that I should. Uh, but I do understand that he was arrested and he's currently incarcerated um, for violating a bunch of, I don't know what laws. But uh, can you just explain what that story is and what the reasoning behind the state and why they did
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Ross created the Silk Road, which was an online marketplace. It was a website where people could buy and sell things, and it was like eBay, but rather than using fiat currency, use Bitcoin at the time. This is back when the fees in the Bitcoin network were smaller, such that it was much more easier to facilitate trade. Right now, the fees are a little bit higher, so it's much more difficult to do this with Bitcoin. But
Yeah,
um, people will buy and sell whatever they want. It was all done on Tor too, by the way, so everything was encrypted, so you could buy and sell anything,
yeah,
um, drugs, guns, you name it.
yeah.
And Ross had a few rules that he was an agorist like me, so he abided by the non-aggression principle.
Okay.
Um, and by the way, if your listeners are interested, all this was based on a book that became a movie called Alongside Night by J. Neil Schulman, another agorist.
Hmm.
Um, Ross read Alongside Night, and that's when he decided to build the Silk Road. So eventually, people were buying and selling stuff, and the feds found him in a library where he was working. He had signed onto the Silk Road, and I guess the way it had worked was if he had closed his laptop, they wouldn't be able to get him. So they made it seem like they were just looking at books and they were whatever, and then they sort of just all jumped on him at the same time and held his computer open. Well, the trial was held in a kangaroo court by a warlord come judge named Catherine B. Forrest, who to apply the word judge to this woman is frankly an insult to any of the good judges if there are any left. But she decided to give Ross a first-time nonviolent offender double life plus 40. Now, there are Nazis at
Wow.
Nuremberg who got less time than that. El
Oh my
Chapo
goodness.
got
Yeah.
less time than that. Slobodan Milosevic got less time than that. African dictators at The Hague have received half of that sentence, less than half of that sentence. So,
Man.
it's not about selling drugs or guns or something like they don't. The truth is the state doesn't give a crap about stuff like that.
Yeah.
They care about people who are threatening their monopoly. And that's what
Right.
Ross did, right? Because if all of a sudden we didn't need them, right? If all of a sudden we could buy and sell stuff uh, without them, that all of a sudden the demand for the U.S. dollar would drop out of the bottom.
Yeah.
Because that's the other important aspect of this is that Ross gave Bitcoin utility.
Right.
Right before Bitcoin, before the Silk Road, it was a sort of novelty thing that I could send you and we could play around with. It was kind of cool to send back and forth to one another. But now with the Silk Road, we saw this is what Bitcoin can do. Wow, look at this. Now, if I tried to buy heroin off of a website with Visa, Visa is going to flag the transaction, probably alert the DEA, and I'm going to get my door kicked down in the middle of the night.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now with Bitcoin, they can't do that, and that's what makes the Silk Road so powerful. That's what makes Ross probably the most effective agorist ever, if
Right.
not, at least top three.
I, and like, are they only selling on something like the Silk Road? Was it only the transactions? Were they only like more illicit things, or was there just more benign transactions going on as
There
well?
was everything. There
Yeah.
was everything, benign and malicious transactions. I mean, there were people selling medicine on the Silk
Okay.
Road
Yeah.
that the FDA hadn't approved that people needed.
Right.
So, I
Right.
mean, these are heroic actions that they're
Yeah.
doing, and like we were talking about earlier, he was also taking the danger out of the drug market, right?
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
helping people, establish a reputation in this sort of anonymous way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah, it is a very like, it's like a harm reduction model,
right.
because you uh uh, vendors end up building reputations and stuff, and then they are incentivized to protect their reputation, right? So it's sort of the idea of self-regulation,
Exactly. And
but that can never happen with everyone just sort of like trust the in Canada it's Health Canada, or the CDC in the States, right? Like, you just yes sir, yes ma'am, and whatever you say is correct,
and the scary part is they're so especially with healthcare, man. I mean, these governments are so inefficient. It's like Hayek said, they have the pretense of knowledge. How do they
Yeah.
know what's best for your health? How do they know what's
Right.
best for my health?
Yeah.
Only you know that because you're
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Like no one else, some politician who lives 1,000 miles from you can't tell you. There's no possible way for them to know what's best for you.
Yeah.
Or like Mises said, they can't calculate economically. There's no way for them to know what you would do with, from an economic perspective. There's no way for them to know what action you would take.
Right.
It's all guesswork. In other words,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and like, I actually want to pick your brain a little bit too. So my wife she's a nurse, and we last year we went and worked a stint in Houston, and she worked at a hospital down there, and it was interesting going from like a universal healthcare system to a private healthcare system. But it was, uh, the whole thing about calling the US system private is like, seems to me to be a huge misnomer, because
right,
the particular hospital maybe there's other hospitals that are different, I don't know, but the particular hospital she was working at, it was like they were 75% funded from Medicare and Medicaid. So they were basically funded by the government anyway. And they were heavily, heavily regulated by the government. So basically they had someone had died because of some kind of failed blood transfusion. So the whole hospital was like super strict about every little rule, right? For when she started working there. And it was like there was like all these state agents there all the time, inspecting, making sure because if they didn't, that hospital could no longer receive the funding, right? So people like say, oh, you want to like turn into the US, and I'm like, well, the US doesn't really have a private healthcare system the way you think it does.
you're 100% right.
Yeah.
It's almost like the option is you have the socialist model or you have the fascist model, and the
Right.
Americans
Yeah.
have chosen the fascist
Yeah,
model.
yeah,
Is the only
exactly.
difference.
Yeah.
It all involves increased governmental control,
Right.
and frankly, it gives the free market a bad name
Yeah, yeah.
because they point to us. They say, "Look how expensive healthcare is," and it's like, yeah, because the government is forcing us to buy these awful policies that no one wants.
Yeah.
You know, I have never complied with the law because it's just egregious to me.
Yeah.
But I remember the first year I looked up on like healthcare dog whatever it was, the Obamacare thing. They wanted like $370 something from me, and I was like in my 20s, and I'm like,
Yeah.
why would I pay this kind of money?
Yeah.
And then it's all to subsidize the elderly people who
Yeah.
can't pay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to me. And I've, if I, for my one physical a year, my doctor charges me $85, I give him cash and I save all of that money throughout the rest of
Right.
the year.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. If they're not forcing you, then they're, subsidizing, or they're mandating doctors require this insurance or something like that. So
Do you
it's out of control.
do you know of any is there any way to engage in healthcare non-violently? And what I mean by that is like without the intervention of somebody with guns, like where you can just make a transaction between you and a medical professional. Is there any way to do that in the US, or is it just all heavily regulated and you have to have insurance or whatever?
Um, you're supposed to have insurance, but like I said, I've never had. I haven't had health insurance since they passed the Obamacare law,
Okay.
and I pay cash for everything.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I'm young, thank God, I'm healthy, and I
Yeah.
don't have to spend a lot of money on healthcare. So, my one visit a year runs me like less than $100. And if I'm sick, then I say to myself, all right, well, you got to pay $200 for a prescription, but
Yeah. Oh
that's
yeah.
that's still a good deal
You're way
considering.
ahead of yeah, you're way ahead of
Right.
the game. Yeah.
And the other thing too is in the socialized systems, you might as well get sick because you're paying for it anyway. So
Yeah.
what's the difference? You
Yeah.
might as well go to the doctor every day because you're going to pay for it one way or another.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and yeah, it is uh people kind of misunderstand the Canadian healthcare system, I think, a lot, especially sort of progressives in the US. Anytime I hear them talking about Canadian healthcare, I just kind of roll my eyes a little bit because it's not the system that they think it is. And I mean, a great example is they've shut down services in Canada significantly because of the pandemic, unnecessarily, by the way, but significantly. So there was already massive shortages in supplies, in staffing necessary to care for everyone's health needs. If you need a hip or knee procedure, 2 years like minimum you're waiting, right, to get a procedure done. And then in that time your injury becomes worse because you're
Right.
aggravating it, right? And then by the time you actually get to the front of the line, then things are really bad for you. But there was a recent report in Ontario where and every the healthcare system is managed provincially. It's not a federally managed. The federal government just divvies out the dollars, and then the provinces manage the healthcare system. But the Ontario healthcare system, there was just a report of as many as 30 deaths due to cardiovascular conditions from people who didn't who were had to forego their procedure that they were waiting for because it was deemed non-essential.
Yeah.
you know
Now imagine a politician telling you that your heart isn't essential.
yeah, I know.
I mean, like, it's absurd to me that these people have blood on their hands and they're
Yeah,
they're allowed to continue walking around among us. It makes me sick to my stomach to hear that 30 people dead. In New York here, we're in the thousands, unfortunately.
yeah, yeah,
I've begun calling Cuomo the butcher of Bronx County because Bronx has got hit so hard by all of this. And it's just, you see it all over the world, New Jersey, California, everywhere where you have these socialist responses. Like you said, most of these areas have already had some semblance of socialized healthcare previously, and they were already under stress from the shortages that are necessary byproducts of that socialization.
yeah.
So now that this pandemic combined with the public response to the pandemic has sort of thrown a match into the tinderbox, so to speak. You know what I mean? And now we can see just how awful this has been. But this is to be expected. Like, this is what happens when you allow the state to manage something as an economic sector as vital as healthcare.
Right. Yeah.
Like, who would put such incompetent people? Who would want a politician in charge of your child's health? That's
Yeah.
insane. That's
Yeah, it
insane.
is. It is
And
insane.
just a quick glance at a history book,
Yeah.
and I don't care what country anybody's from. You could be from Ethiopia, and you could look up what that government's done, I bet you they have done something malicious with the healthcare of whoever they thought was their enemy at some point in time.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's pretty egregious. What
In
they
America, we had, thank God, it's called we call it the Tuskegee experiments, where the state went into the deep rural South. This is back in like the 50s or 60s, I believe, and they promised the freed blacks, "We're going to give you guys free health care." But what they really did was they were injecting them with syphilis intentionally.
Yes, yeah, I've heard of this.
So I mean, who in their right minds
Right.
wants these that same entity to be injecting us
Well,
mandatory?
in Canada too. I believe around the same time period in the 50s or something. There were hospitals that were they were I don't know what the word for it. They were chemically making indigenous women infertile because they would have like a lot of kids, right? And it would be like a strain on the healthcare system. But
And,
the state would do this kind of stuff, and it's just
and that's the other thing too, is that as so like we give them the power to manage the healthcare system,
yeah,
so that when something like when something goes wrong, they have to cover up for themselves to maintain that monopoly.
yeah,
So it's like, oh man, the healthcare system's getting stressed. We have to start murdering or sterilizing women now because we
right,
can't we can't bear that burden anymore. Well, guess what? A free market, a privatized market, could handle that stress, no
yeah,
problem,
yeah,
no
yeah,
problem. There's
exactly,
doctors who would love to do. I'm sure in Canada right now, there's some orthopedic surgeon who's sitting at home watching TV when he could be doing that poor woman's hip surgery, but
right,
he
yeah,
can't.
yeah. Oh yeah, it's terrible, and I don't even know how we're ever gonna crawl out of it because it's just pushed everything way back, and I don't know how the system's gonna handle. And Canada spends 60% of our federal budget is healthcare, which is amazing.
And
uh,
and like you said, it's all provincially managed.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's pretty wild, but yeah. So just before we wrap up here, do you want to like plug any of your stuff where we can find you?
Yeah, of course. So I have salvigors.com, and really that's where you can find everything. I've got a blog, newlibertarian.io, which I also publish at salvigors.com. But there you can find, I've got my podcast is up the Agora. You can find links for the blog, the show notes, and I also have I sell like liberty. I put memes and stuff on T-shirts, and that's all at
Mm.
salvigors.com. So check that out.
Yeah, and follow Sal on Twitter. He's a pretty good Twitter follow. So
Thank you. Yeah, at
yeah,
Sally Mayweather.
yeah. All right. Cool. Thanks, man. Thanks for coming.
You got it. Thanks for having me. Let's do it again.
Yeah. Peace, bro.